Welcome to Youth Empowerment Radio. This is the second episode of our exciting second season. In this episode, we share a moving and anonymous story that highlights the challenges faced by unhoused LGBTQI youth in rural Colorado. Together, we'll explore the urgent need to expand resources like stable housing and reliable transportation to support these youth. Thank you for tuning in. Let's make a difference together.
The material and information presented here is provided by lived experience youth and is for general information purposes only. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are of those of the guest only and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Youth Move.
So when we're doing work around queer and trans youth that are LGBTQI and experiencing homelessness or housing instability, there are a lot of factors that come into play that not only make our youth more vulnerable to losing housing stabilities, but also to then gaining resources that they need access to once that happens. Parts of that, especially in rural areas, is considerate of geographic location, making sure that they have affirming resources that not only are culturally relevant and appropriate for their identity, but that are safe and affirming around the societal attitudes towards LGBTQI youth in the first place. Family rejection is a lot higher within queer and trans youth populations, and what some communities have is like faith resources that are great for other kids and families don't always serve LGBTQIA youth. We face a lot of continued stigma and discrimination, social isolation, discrimination in housing and employment, different programs that might be for boys or for girls or run by specific communities that are not affirming, discrimination in healthcare, education systems, especially around the current attitudes of the public or the legislative practices that are happening right now and putting especially our rural kids at risk for further mental health issues. They have higher rates of trauma, more diversity of trauma, different types of trauma that not all providers are equipped to deal with. Overall, it's a lack of affirming services. So when we're serving young people that have LGBTQI identities on top of the issues that we're already struggling to reach youth on around housing instability and food insecurity, we then cross into a different cultural relevancy that we simply can't serve in all rural areas that don't have these resources available. I think one of the biggest problems is the invisibility of data. It's hard for us to calculate the data and see the real impact of LGBTQI youth within some of these systems, because for some of them, disclosing that identity is a danger. It poses a danger or recreates trauma that has already existed for them. Some of the solutions that we know work and that we see in my program are building up social networks and a sense of belonging. Informal networks that are limited in rural spaces can be created in a fairly inexpensive way, as long as they're continually supported through larger programs. Attitudes from the public around anti-trans inclusivity and efforts that are happening in small towns, legislative efforts at the state level that are not being promoted in a youth support-driven way. Things that work are targeted and informed interventions. So not just trauma-informed, but also LGBTQI-informed, letting them know the statistics and the stigma around those pieces are not necessarily scary or out of bounds for us to actually work with. Of course, there's funding barriers, so additional funding specific to marginalized communities, including our BIPOC youth, our LGBTQI youth, especially our trans youth of color, experience the multiplied discrimination. And finally, the affirming services, the availability of that, especially now with technology. How can our rural resources have a connection to informed and affirming services that they use at a statewide level, even if it's not local to them. But we even struggle with it in urban areas. I mean, they just simply don't come out to their doctors, right? Like that's the reality is like they and that creates trauma. So they're hiding this piece that they've connected on the internet. So now they know what it's about, right? We're in a new generation of like knowing what identity looks like for young people, but then they don't have the resources to do anything about it. And so leaving home either early or when they turn 18 feels safer for them, but then they don't have any of the pieces they need. There's not a pathway for them to go, especially if they can get out of these rural spaces. They're still not, then they're a struggling person in an urban space, and it's the same. And they don't have some of those skills that young people that grew up in urban spaces have, right? In metro areas where they've kind of learned some of those street skills and stuff. And this is important. Some of our young people in rural areas, because housing opportunities and safe spaces are so limited, some of them resort to exchanging sex or their body for housing. And although the cases I know about are all adults, young adults, there's an issue of consent there because is it consent if they're exchanging for housing and for food? But sex work becomes a resource for them. And while that's nothing to be ashamed of, it's still not always a safe place for them, right? Because there's that defining power and that difference in accessing resources when you have a person that is pseudo taking care of you in exchange for whatever their needs are. So that and the invisibility around being body positive and pro sex work, but while understanding that for some people that is their livelihood rather than their choice or their option. That's really scary. And a lot of our young adults resort to that because historically, the gay community has offered that as an option. It just doesn't always prove to be safe, especially when they're considered a runaway or even if they're over 18, they're currently unhoused. They're not connected to a system. So they just get lost into that world and it becomes their coping strategy that is effective. So it continues on for a lot of years until different like STIs happen or some sort of level of crisis intervenes that they didn't anticipate. They thought it wouldn't happen with them, but then they don't have the resource connections because they've received their care from someone else that was benefiting for less genuine ways. So they don't have systems interaction also and don't know how to access that because there's so much shame that goes along with sex work as well. So that just becomes this really entangled arena that they have to navigate through with limited resources from the very start. The family rejection or whatever moved them out of the neglect, that type of thing that moved them out of their family system to start with. So it gets big. I think for healthcare, not coming out to their providers puts up additional barriers. So as a queer person, there are pieces that my healthcare provider needs to know. As a trans person, their bodies may not align with the medical procedures that their identities talk about needing. This isn't about surgery access and hormone replacement therapy. Sometimes it's just about accepting and being able to get annual checkups, vaccinations, basic medical care as a trans or queer individual, and how they have that additional barrier just in the fear of coming out. So I think that helping young people connect with trusted providers is one of the resources that we can do better on. Incentivizing those providers that are affirming and accepting to stay in rural areas because they tend to move to metro areas where they're going to be more protected by county policies or city ordinances and things like that. But as this legislation comes around and it's even coming into Colorado, we're even seeing some of the efforts. They're not passing yet, but the efforts are there, and that anxiety that it induces when legislative changes are on the brink. Young people are paying attention to all of that. They're seeing all of that, but they don't have a sense of control over that. So it starts to impede on their sense of belonging, even in a town where they sort of feel okay as themselves. Legislatively, it becomes dangerous, and that applies to their healthcare, their education, their housing potentials, their food security, all of the pieces. And that anxiety weighs really heavily. And then they can't seek support for that because they're not being able to be out to their providers, mental health or healthcare, like physical health. So even if a young person can find a provider like in Denver or a metro area that they feel comfortable connecting to, some of our kids up in Weld County and Greeley, they've never even left the city of Greeley. All of their resources that they need for basic survival are there. And so even getting down the interstate on a public bus, it's $30 minimum one way, an hour and a half trip, and then getting back. And where do they put their belongings, especially ours that camp? Where do they put their belongings while they take that trip to the doctor's office in Denver? We have some youth services that cross over into Fort Collins, and there's one bus that goes once or twice, I think, 2 round trips every day between a big hub within Weld County over to Fort Collins. But it's the goal of that bus is for college students that may not live within CSU or UNC areas. So it's morning and afternoon. And what do they do with their bike? They can't take that bike and do all of the things that they need to do in their backpack and their tent and those pieces. So what do they do with all of their personal belongings when that happens? When we don't have youth homeless services, at least those that don't have huge eligibility, we don't have even lockers for young people. We have adult resources. We don't have young resources. Even our adult LGBTQIA community in Northern Colorado, they don't have a good shelter where they can stay. A lot of our trans women will stay closeted and present as men because that's how they are able to be in a shelter. Biologically, like even though it's not on paper, they still have to go with where they biologically fit rather than where they identify, because we have more access for men's shelters. And so our trans women are having to not be their genuine self. And that's for adults, right? Where there's additional resources. Our youth have zero. Getting to medical appointments, assuming that they're on Medicaid. We do a lot of enrollment into Medicaid and food stamps in the first place. They just didn't know how to sign up, and they didn't know how easy it is in Colorado to fill out the application online. We have youth using our address, so they have a physical address to come to or to get mailed to and to kind of give residency. But when they find a provider that is Boulder or Denver, getting there is the first barrier. Getting there in time for their appointment, on the wait list for multiple months, sometimes getting into those appointments, but then reaching back through to mental health services. We have a lot of providers in Northern Colorado that are queer and trans friendly, but they have either insurance barriers. Many of them are cash pay only, which means non-existent for many of our invisible young people. And if they do accept Medicaid, they have waiting lists for those, or they have caps. Even myself, I've experienced the Medicaid cap that happens in lots of our public healthcare systems. So they don't have any more room for Medicaid clients right now. They only take 10 a year or something like that. And I'm fully resourced and I'm able to navigate those resources, and I experience that. So our young people that don't have those resources will sit together and make those calls for sometimes a couple of hours at a time to see what provider we can even get in with and what provider will let them come to an appointment without a parent signing off on things. And sometimes we have to point out the law to both medical professionals and law enforcement that says this kid can consent for themselves. They can consent to taking this ride with, quote, a stranger up to the youth shelter that exists in Boulder. These kids can consent to their own medical care, and like having to pull up the law for a medical provider, that shouldn't happen. But that's the kind of stuff we do in our program because that gives them the opportunity to at least receive those services and know whether it's something they can go back to, and then helping to mediate if it wasn't trans friendly or trans accepting, or that if the medical provider won't move forward without parental consent, then helping them to navigate the socio-emotional aspects of what that looks like after they leave the doctor's office and hear this news when they don't have adults that they can go cry on the shoulder of, right? So navigating all of those pieces and making sure that they have that support around their basic needs is something we need all over rural Colorado. And I do think that developing some sort of pipeline system so we can access this better would be a solution. Building up the information and the informed trauma, but also culturally relevant trauma informed. Those aspects really are necessary through rural areas of Colorado. And they give up. It's like they've tried 5 doctors maybe, or they've tried 5 mental health therapists, and like nobody gets them. So they give up. And then they create their sense of belonging. Like we have groups of kids that live together. We rarely have like one kid camping. It's usually 3 or 4. And our police do sweeps. They'll just take their stuff and they'll give people a ticket, threaten to arrest them if they stay there. They have to take off. All their stuff is left behind. And then it goes into evidence for a couple of months. And then eventually it'll make it back out where they can claim it. But by then they've replaced all of their stuff, right? And that's one of the things we do is help to replace stuff. But where do they put their stuff? We have people leaving stuff at our center all the time because there's no other place to lock it up. Kids can put important documents at our center. Like we have a locked cabinet that there's 2 people that have a key to. So there's a slight barrier that like one of us have to be around, but they can still access it basically anytime when there's daylight. So where do they keep that important stuff? They didn't even know they needed their birth certificate for all these things. So once we get a copy of their birth certificate, where are they going to keep it? Knowing that a sweep could happen at any time. We have a lot of couch surfers too. Safe families that they know they can stay with or that we know they can stay with, so we'll introduce them to. Lots of our former families, so families that have had youth in our program that didn't experience homelessness or any of these other pieces and were just queer and trans kids. As their kids have grown up, then those can be places that we can call up the family and say, like, I've got a kiddo that needs a space for a couple of weeks while we build resources and do all of our pieces that we can do to intervene. So that's been really helpful. But that's taken 7.5 years to develop that type of host home, like informal host home setting. How do we build that in multiple areas in rural Colorado, right? How do we find those safe people? A lot of that happened because I was connected to the community already and my own lived experience. And so all of my connections then have connections and pushing myself into meetings sometimes. So how do we do that in other spaces where we're still dealing with acceptance and affirmation? I don't know yet.